Hey, everybody. It is Monday, December 9th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to, and cover once in a century news events on a monthly basis.
That's really what it feels like, right?
Remarkable events in the Middle East over the weekend, Jill. Something that even the geopolitical analysts that we trust on things were like, oh my God, I cannot believe the downfall of the regime there. We'll have a lot on it in just a bit on the podcast. Happened so quickly. And we'll try to dive into today why it happened in the way it happened.
Moshe, there's the geopolitical news, and then there's also the personal news. How was Chicago?
Chicago was great. I got to see family there. Of course, I'm originally from the Chicago area. My brother is still there. We took Olivia to come hang with the cousins, and I happened to be there initially for business. I was moderating an event. I was interviewing Bill Maher, the comedian and talk show host for an event for the Jewish Federation of Chicago. So it was an honor and very cool to have a chance to speak with him for nearly an hour in front of an audience of about 1,000 people. Talked about politics, media, anti-Semitism, fascinating conversation. He was very much the guy that you see on Real Time, very blunt, very straightforward, and taking time to challenge both sides, giving it to both Republicans and Trump as well as Democrats.
All right. I would say let's get some clips up, but I know that it was a private event, so we'll just have to take your word for it.
Unfortunately, it's a private event, so no video or audio available. But we did talk afterwards, and I do hope to be able to have him on this podcast, or maybe at some point we'll be invited onto the panel at Real Time. We shall see.
Both sound amazing. All right, let's get to the headlines because there's a lot of them. Some remarkable developments in Syria over the weekend. Rebels overthrow dictator Bashar al-Assad after the families ruled the country for more than 50 years. So we look at the shocking news, what's next for Syria, and how this plays into the broader conflict in the Middle East. Back here at home, the NYPD releases some new photos and new details as it looks for the person who killed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, why they think the suspected killer was carrying a backpack filled with Monopoly money. And Donald Trump gives his first major post-election interview. He talks about what is on his agenda, including details about his deportation plans, issuing tariffs, and how he'll approach conflicts around the world. Some developments when it comes to TikTok, as a U.S. appeals court upheld a law that will require TikTok's Chinese owner to either sell the app or be banned here in the United States. Jay-Z accused in a civil lawsuit of rape, along with Sean Diddy Combs. What we know about the lawsuit and how Jay-Z is responding. The U.S. Department of Agriculture will now be testing all raw milk for traces of bird flu after hundreds of dairy cows and dozens of people tested positive for the virus. And for those still singing Wicked songs after seeing the blockbuster movie, a little Wizard of Oz news for you. The ruby slippers worn by Judy Garland in the movie sold for a record-breaking amount of money. Plus Moshe is on this day in history.
Yeah, quite a number for those ruby slippers. As far as on this day in history, a separate movie clue for you. For those of you familiar with the line, "Say hello to my little friend." Say hello to my little friend.
He doesn't deliver it quite that way.
No, I'm saying it way too cutesy.
Yeah, like you're spending too much time with
Say hello
Olivia.
to my little friend. Anyway, for those unfamiliar or being like, Moshe, you're saying it the wrong way, wait till the end of the podcast.
All right, so the news here, let's start with some shocking developments in the Middle East this weekend. After a 13-year civil war, a group of rebels took control of the Syrian capital of Damascus, and longtime Syrian dictator President Bashar al-Assad fled the country for Russia Saturday night. He and his father had ruled the country for more than 50 years. It comes after a rapid week-long offensive where rebel soldiers took over major government-controlled cities across northern Syria, culminating in their capture of the capital over the weekend. The pictures of them taking control of the presidential palace, with citizens toppling statues of the Assad family and breaking political prisoners out of jail, pretty remarkable. Russian media reports that Assad had been granted political asylum in Moscow in a move that effectively ends more than 5 decades of his family's rule. He and his father ruled with an iron fist, torturing and killing thousands of Syrians in order to preserve power. And now it looks like the leading rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, will lead a coalition of groups that now control the country. HTS is an Islamic fundamentalist group. Their goal is to create a totalitarian Islamist state in Syria. The US and the United Nations have officially deemed HTS a terrorist group. Their leader, Mohammed al-Jalani, is the next potential leader of Syria. In recent weeks, he's been trying to sell himself as more moderate than other jihadist groups in the region. He's trying to be seen as a responsible party that will cooperate with international leaders. He came up, though, as a member of al-Qaeda, creating their affiliate in Syria before breaking away from al-Qaeda several years ago. The prime minister under the previous Assad regime has agreed to transfer power peacefully to HTS.
So there appears to be some cooperation here. While Assad has fled the country along with a number of other leaders, the prime minister has stayed behind and clearly trying to save face here and maybe save his own life by cooperating with the rebels. You mentioned HTS there, Jill, though we should mention this is a coalition of a number of rebel groups, both secular and jihadis, Islamist groups here. But in recent years, especially in contrast to the beginning of the Syrian civil war, you have seen these religious fundamentalist groups take charge here when it comes to the Syrian civil war, the rebel groups. And that's why there is, and we'll get to this just in a bit here, some concern that the new guys may not be much better than the old guys.
Or potentially worse, right? The expression, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know.
Absolutely.
All right, just to rewind a little bit here, the civil war started in Syria about 13 years ago, and that's when anti-government protesters initially tried to ask Assad for more rights. And in case you're unfamiliar with the Arab Spring, it was just a series of pro-democracy protests really across the entire Arab world. Assad responded by cracking down on protests with violence, using chemical weapons against his own people, killing hundreds of thousands of Syrians. The death toll from the last decade has surpassed more than 600,000. The UN has actually just stopped keeping count, and more than 14 million Syrians, 2/3 of the country, have been displaced, with large parts of the country destroyed. In the past couple of years, the civil war has been in somewhat of a stalemate. Assad's regime has maintained control of about 2/3 of Syrian territory. The government had been relying heavily on allied forces, including Russia, Iran, and the Iran-supported terrorist group Hezbollah, to help them maintain control in the region. But those allies have recently shifted their focus to wars at home. They've been weakened and distracted, which has left the Syrian troops very vulnerable. And last weekend, rebel groups took advantage of the geopolitical situation and stormed the second largest city of Aleppo in a surprise attack. In just 1 week, they have since captured huge swaths of territory, revealing just how weak Assad's forces had become. Many didn't even bother fighting back. Some of the most remarkable video, Moshe, were these soldiers just changing out of their uniforms into street clothes instead of fighting.
Yeah, there was video over the weekend of them in alleyways just taking off their Syrian military uniforms and not even bothering to fight as these rebels whiz by in pickup trucks with their guns. The soldiers deciding not even worth fighting for this guy Assad anymore. We're done after 13 years.
So as the rebels made their way into the capital of Damascus, they were seen releasing prisoners as well from government-run prisons, taking over the Damascus airport. And you could just see Syrians overjoyed, celebrating the overthrow of the Assad government in the streets, handing out candy, firing off guns in celebration. So certainly, at least it appears right now, a lot of joy from everyday Syrians.
Yeah, it's hard to describe what this means to Syrians, many of whom have only ever lived under the dictatorships of Hafez Assad. This is the father who died in 2000, and then the son, Bashar Assad. Let's just take a moment here to talk about how big a development this is. Bashar's father, Hafez, seized rule in the early 70s. He actually came up in the mid-60s, was a defense minister, takes full control as part of the Ba'ath Party, which, by the way, was also the party of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They basically seized power at similar times then in Iraq and Syria. He used force, including murdering civilians in mass and kids to maintain power, imprisoning tens of thousands of people, sometimes for life, no communication with their families ever. And so Bashar Assad seen as a cold-blooded ruler. And so he rules the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. His oldest son, who was actually supposed to take over, dies in a car accident. He was driving like 150 miles per hour to an airport for a ski vacation one time. He dies. Second son, Bashar, becomes the heir apparent here. There's another brother who's sort of a complete and utter nut job that even the father was like, I can't put him in charge. I'm going to put Bashar in charge. Who is Bashar Assad? He's a Western-educated doctor. He studies an ophthalmologist in Europe. So there was hope when his father, Hafez, died in 2000, that while he's an Assad, he's a dictator, he takes over, the family rule here, that he would be different from his father, that he might allow some more rights to the people. He might be able to work with the West. Well, it became very clear very quickly that that was not the case. In fact, in many cases, he was even worse than his father, again, imprisoning tens of thousands of people, using chemical weapons against people to instill fear here, imprisoning sometimes entire families or killing entire families. Just a rule, Jill, that many Westerners cannot even imagine. So when you see these pictures of people celebrating in Syria, regardless of who is taking over here, regardless of what comes the next day, the just pure joy that this pain of 50 plus years is over cannot be understated. I was looking at video late Sunday night of family members waiting outside the prisons as right now civilians, as we record this, are trying to break into the prisons to free their family members, some of whom have been in prison for potentially decades here. They don't know. There's no sign. There were no trials. Many of them, Syrian regime prisons, Jill, many of them are underground with no windows. People are kept in multiple levels of basements. And it turns out that the prison guards, part of the Assad regime, escaped without releasing anybody. They had the codes to open up the doors, so they're literally using construction equipment to dig underground to try to figure out who's being held in these basement prisons. At the same time, you had people walk into the Assad palaces where he has hundreds of luxury vehicles. They're walking through these rows of Ferraris and Lamborghinis paid for with money that Assad stole from the country. They were going through his DVD collection. Notably, Jill, despite hating the West, he loves Western film. And so I posted a photo on Instagram. Among the DVDs that Bashar Assad had in his collection, Borat.
So I saw that you posted that. I also was looking at what other DVDs he had. But do you think that he knew that Borat was satire?
Listen, I've never spoken to Bashar Assad. I'm not, that familiar with him. It is ironic, Sacha Baron Cohen being an Orthodox Jew actor too, as well, given Assad's view of Jews in Israel. Nonetheless, it's a remarkable thing. People were remarking, they're like, wait, why are there children roaming the presidential palace? I'm like, well, these people are trying to, it's a historic event here. So some people have decided to take their kids, into the presidential palace, as people around them are looting, to just see, this guy who ran this country and made life hell for all of us, like, who was he and what has he done with all the money that he's plundered from this country for all these years? So that's what's happening there. So Assad in Russia, he's left. And now what happens next for the country of Syria, which people were curious over the weekend, is about the size of Oklahoma or Washington State in terms of square miles, if you just kind of want a reference point here. And it's a very diverse country that has both religious people, but also a lot of secular people, Christians, Druze tribes, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims. Notably, the Assad family were Shias, or a subsect of Shias, and so they were allied with the Iranians and Hezbollah, even though it's a majority Sunni country. These rebels have taken over, are Sunni here, who have been particularly mistreated, despite being the majority of the country, by the minority-led Assad family, the Alawite sect, that's been leading Syria now for several decades. So now to what comes next. You mentioned this group HTS, an extremist Islamist group that began as an offshoot, as the Syrian affiliate of al-Qaeda, al-Nusra. Their leader, al-Jalani, took part in actually launching that al-Qaeda affiliate. How did he get there? Well, he happens to be of a Syrian family, born in Saudi Arabia, but then they moved back to Syria. And he gets inspired post 9/11 to join insurgents in Iraq. The U.S. had just invaded Iraq, and he went to go fight the U.S. He was then put in in prison by the U.S., held in prison for a number of years there in Iraq, and then released. Had his issues with some of the al-Qaeda folks there, and they said, we're happy to get rid of you, go off to Syria and create our Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate. He goes off and does that with a guy that he knows very well named al-Baghdadi. Who's al-Baghdadi? You might sound familiar. He goes on to create ISIS. They have a falling out, Jelani and Baghdadi. Baghdadi goes on to create ISIS. Jelani is running the al-Qaeda affiliate. But then he has an issue with the al-Qaeda guys, and he's like, you know what? We're going to change the name here. I'm going to take a different tack when it comes to my approach to Islamic rule. The thing is, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they're all about global Islamic rule. He's very much like, I want to create an Islamic state I want to create an Islamic country here in Syria. I'm not into the global thing. I'm not into fighting the West. And so that has been part of what Jelani's been trying to argue here as he's led these rebel groups, recently had the success here in taking out Assad. He's actually changed his look. He's taken his head covering off. He's given up some of his military religious attire, actually for more button-down shirts. He has more of a Zelensky look. If you look at how he's been dressing, how he has been talking. He's trying to come off as a moderate here. Jill, we should note that he is still a wanted man. He's considered a terrorist by the U.S., the UN, Europe. He has been connected to a number of deaths of American soldiers, and there's actually a $10 million U.S. bounty on Jelani's head. At the same time, there's been reporting the past 48 hours, you got to be realistic here, that U.S. officials through third parties have been in touch with Jelani here, despite the fact that he is a wanted terrorist. He could be here the next leader of Syria. And the big question we all ask is this moderate shtick a shtick? Or is this serious here? You know, we did hear from the Taliban as they were taking over Afghanistan the second time a couple years ago. We're not like the old Taliban. Like, we're like a new, friendlier Taliban. Well, they have banned women from the public. They have banned women from working. The Taliban, same old Taliban. Iran, the Islamic regime, as they were revolutionaries in the late 70s, early 80s. No, don't worry. We're all about, having a more open society. Well, we know how Iran has turned out. So there are major questions here about HTS and Mr. Jelani and what exactly he's going to create here. Will he actually try to have an election here? Will he put together a coalition here? Notably, in the area HTS has been running in Syria and northern Syria the past couple of years. As you mentioned, Assad only controlled 2/3 of Syria. The rebels, this group had a bit of Syria. They have allowed minority groups and minority sects to lead relatively normal lives, though we should note, despite the sort of I'm more moderate and I wear button-down shirts, women in the areas that HES has controlled almost entirely wearing head coverings. So there is a question here of whether they're enforcing it or whether you just sort of assume it. What sort of religiosity, what level of religion will they bring to Syria here? And ultimately, is this the end of the civil war, or is this just the beginning of another phase? Because in Syria, it's not just Assad versus these rebels. There are multiple fighting parties, and we haven't even gotten to all of them yet.
Okay, so all that being said, the question is this good news? Is this bad news? How are we processing this? So the West, the United States, Israel, I guess you could say they're all extremely cautious right now. Israel in particular, because it borders Syria. So they're worried about basically having like an al-Qaeda right on their border. And because of that, the IDF has said that it captured a very small piece of territory called the buffer zone on the Syrian side of its border in the Golan Heights. The buffer zone was established in a truce after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. In the downfall of the Assad regime, they're worried that rebels could push out UN peacekeepers in the area. And they say they're going to hold on to it until they can get a deal with the rebels. Israel told the Biden administration it is a temporary move as they get a clearer view of the rebel group's intentions in Syria. And they want to make sure that they can ensure safety and stability for their residents that live along the Syrian border. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said the collapse of the Assad regime opens up a lot of opportunities in the region and was directly related to Israel's assaults on Hezbollah and Iran. certainly no coincidence that the rebels started to make moves just as Hezbollah was so weakened that it agreed to that ceasefire with Israel.
Yeah, this is something you heard from President Biden yesterday, too, that some of the radical shifts that we've seen here in the past 14 months, and particularly in the last 14 days in Syria, can be directly tied to October 7th and some of the developments thereafter. The thing about Assad, while he ruled Syria with an iron fist, in the last few years, his military was so weak that he was very dependent on Iran, Russia, and then Iran's supported group Hezbollah to basically bail him out, to do the fighting for him. But what's developed in the past couple of years? Well, Russia has invaded Ukraine, is heavily invested there. They have pulled some of their troops out of Syria to fight in Ukraine. And frankly, it appears while Putin is letting Assad live in Russia, that despite investing billions of dollars in him and years into Syria, that he was just done and wasn't ready to put up another fight on behalf of Assad. Same with Hezbollah, who has been very weakened by the Israeli offensive in the past couple months here. Hezbollah, decided to join in with Hamas after October 7th. And in the past couple months here, their leadership's been decimated. Their weapons have been decimated. They're unable to fight on behalf of Assad. And then add to that Iran, which has had a couple of changes here with the Israelis. Iran is in a very difficult position and a much more weakened position here in the year since October 7th. So you actually have heard some cases here where some of the Syrian rebels, as much as they hate Israel, have effectively acknowledged that they probably wouldn't have been able to take Assad so quickly if it hadn't been for how much Israel has decimated Hezbollah and Iran here. So this is a major loss here for Russia, which has had bases in Syria. It's unclear whether they're going to keep any bases there, given how the rebels feel about Russia and the support that they have given Assad, the atrocities they've committed on behalf of Assad against the rebels. So this is a loss for Putin in the region. This is a loss for Iran in the region, which has effectively, in the past couple of years, had a domination over Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, a whole crescent, they call a Shia crescent of power there. So there's a huge loss for the Iranians. This does open up some opportunities here for Lebanon, which for decades has been dominated by Syria, dominated by Hezbollah, has had basically unable to really do much. So the economy has gone to zero. It's experienced major issues and can't really determine its own fate until now. So we shall see what this means for Lebanon. But, Jill, just looking back at October 7th here, the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, who launched that attack, his goal with October 7th was that this would help inspire an Arab-Muslim world war against Israel. Instead, if you look back through the context of the past 14 months here, while Israel certainly has its issues on the international stage, anti-Semitism has increased, and Israel certainly has a lot of challenges it didn't have before. At the same time, if you look regionally, Israel has never been militarily stronger in the region. And in the 14 months, you've seen the destruction of Gaza, the death of Sinwar, nearly all Hamas leaders, the killing of Hezbollah leaders, nearly all of them, major weakening of that group, a major weakening of Iran, and now the fall of the Assad regime, a huge ally of both Hezbollah and Iran, and just a remarkable turn of events here. Following October 7th. One country we have not mentioned yet, Jill, that also played a key role in this, Turkey, which borders Syria to the north. They basically gave the green light here to the rebels to do this. They've been negotiating with Assad. They have an issue. Why? There's 5 million Syrian refugees living in Turkey. They wanted them back. Assad wasn't really finding a way to take them back. So Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, basically gave the green light to the rebels, being like, finish him. We're done with him. And this is an opportunity for Turkey now to exert its influence over the region, over Syria, because the sense is there's a quid pro quo here, because he's supporting the rebels that have taken over Damascus. Well, I haven't mentioned another rebel group, the Kurds, the Kurdish group and the ethnicity that lives in Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. They're basically enemy number one for Turkey. So the question is, on behalf of Turkey, will these rebels in Damascus, Jalani and company, now turn their attention to another rebel group that was also trying to take out Assad, but ultimately is a cause for an issue for Turkey? Will rebel group Jalani, HTS, now fight against the Kurdish rebel group that basically manages most of northeastern Syria, leading to another stage here of Syrian civil war? There has been talk by the Americans and Europeans to talk to Turkey. There has been talk that the Europeans and Americans are now talking to Turkey, being like, yo, can you just end this at this point? Whereas now Turkey feels like it's in a strong position and that it's supported the new leaders in Syria to be able to utilize them for their own ends. Jill, as we mentioned at the top, this is not a very simple situation.
No, and like everything, it's the law of unintended consequences, right? So just when you think maybe something's going to be good for one party or for another party, wait a while, and it turns out it's going to be the opposite. So you never really know which way these things are going to go. As for the U.S. role here, we have a new administration that's about to take over. President-elect Trump on Sunday urged the U.S. to not intervene in Syria's rebel takeover, writing on his social media platform, Truth Social, in all caps, "Let it play out. Do not get involved." Trump, if you remember, made the call to pull most U.S. troops out from Syria during his administration after the defeat of ISIS, even though ISIS rebels still remain in Syria. At the same time, on Sunday, President Biden said that U.S. forces, 900 of whom are deployed in the country, had conducted dozens of airstrikes targeting ISIS camps and operatives in Syria as a way to try to stabilize the region. Biden said he was clear-eyed that ISIS would try and take advantage of the power vacuum and that the U.S. was not going to let that happen. He committed the U.S. to helping the Syrian people establish a new government in the days to come. Take a listen.
We will engage with all Syrian groups, including within the process led by the United Nations, to establish a transition away from the Assad regime toward independent, sovereign, I want to say it again, sovereign Syria, with a new constitution, a new government that serves all Syrians. And this process will be determined by the Syrian people themselves.
The president also said he believes that they can rescue an American journalist, Austin Tice, who was abducted while reporting in Syria 12 years ago and is believed to be alive.
Yeah, there hasn't been much sign of life or proof of life in a while now. So holding out hope that the change here will allow us to learn new information and hopefully find him alive. So the bottom line here, Jill, a 50-year dictatorship, murderous dictatorship, is gone from Syria. The future here, TBD. The rebels here, led by a former al-Qaeda leader who's killed U.S. troops, but has reformed, wears button-down shirts, and says he's not the same guy that he once was. There's a Kurdish military force in the north that Turkey wants out, and maybe wants to use the rebels who took Damascus to fight them. U.S. still has about 900 troops in the region. We should mention on Sunday, bombed a number of sites, because who else is in Syria? ISIS is there as well. So you have the rebel group that's taken over Damascus. You have the Kurds in the northeast. You have ISIS sort of scattershot around the country. ISIS, by the way, fights against everybody. They hate everybody. They fight the rebels in the north. They fight the rebels in Damascus. They fight the Americans. They fight everybody, and everybody fights them. And so you have all those various parties there. You have Trump saying, don't get involved, though we do have U.S. troops there, even though Trump pulled out the majority of them back in 2019. The Russians still have soldiers in the region. Iran has pulled out a whole bunch of stuff, but they're still sort of futzing around in the region. The Israelis on the other side of the border, but the Israelis also engaged in a number of campaigns over the weekend, Jill, bombing campaigns across Syria, because they knew of a number of chemical weapons facilities and missile facilities that Assad still had. Well, the Israelis do not want those in the hands of al-Qaeda or any other organization there. And so they made a point of launching a whole bunch of bombing campaigns across Syria over the region to take out what they knew about in terms of Assad leftover weapons that his team and his military has left behind. So things moving forward could be even more complicated than we've seen in the past. There is an opportunity for this to be a much better situation than has existed for many people. There's also the opportunity for this to be a much worse situation than has been for a number of people. And so while there's celebrations right now that this does allow for new opportunities, a lot of nervousness, both in the country, around the Middle East, and around the world right now about what this means. Jill, one notable picture I'll leave folks with, the number of Syrians. There were aerial photos of Syrians driving back from Turkey into Syria, some of whom have been in Turkey now as refugees, as displaced people for more than a decade, looking to return to their country, now Assad-free for the first time. And so there are people who are headed back, at least to see what's happened to their country, see what's happened to their families and their friends. And so, 24 hours in here, there's still a lot of people who are optimistic about what could be.
Moshe, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not so many of the Syrians who fled and went to Europe, particularly Germany, the UK, other countries, whether or not they decide that they want to return to Syria.
Yeah, I think a lot of them will be watching and seeing, what unfolds and what regime takes power there, and what the nature of that regime is. But also to what extent some of these countries will continue to allow the refugees to stay there now that Assad is gone. In particular, we're talking about Turkey, which has taken on more than 5 million of them, but even countries like Germany, etc. Nearly 1 million Syrian refugees have come into Germany over the course of the past decade.
All right, time for the speed read from the New York Times. Some new information came out over the weekend on the mysterious gunman in the killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in Midtown Manhattan last week. On Sunday, the NYPD released 2 new images of a man that they are calling a person of interest in the shooting. One image is from a cab that the suspected gunman took to the Port Authority bus station. He was peering forward from the cab's back seat with his face partially covered by a blue surgical mask. The second image that the NYPD released shows the unidentified suspect through a car window. He's wearing that same mask, a black puffer jacket, and a hood pulled over his head. Authorities believe that the shooter fled the scene of the crime in Midtown Manhattan at the New York Hilton Midtown at 6:45 a.m., then traveled 7 miles to the Uptown bus station in just 45 minutes. And from there, they're not sure where he went. There's still a lot of information that police are trying to put together, like the e-bike that he rode through Central Park before hailing a cab. That is nowhere to be found. Also missing is the gun used in the shooting. Hundreds of detectives are on the case, and even scuba divers were combing through a Central Park lake over the weekend searching for evidence.
They are not empty-handed, though, Jill. This guy left a lot of tracks behind. DNA and a partial fingerprint were found on a Starbucks water bottle the suspect bought before shooting. They're analyzing a discarded burner phone found near the scene. There's also some cryptic evidence. Last week, we reported that the shell casings found at the crime scene engraved with the words deny, depose, defend. Those words seem like a direct dig at the health insurance industry's methods for rejecting medical coverage. And then there's this, the backpack that apparently he ditched in Central Park. It had Monopoly money inside of it in a jacket. So is he playing a game here with authorities? It appears so, based on some longtime homicide detectives who feel like he's playing some sort of cat and mouse game, taunting authorities, especially leaving Monopoly money inside a backpack in Central Park that he knew would be found. They're asking the public right now for help in identifying him. And Jill, there's not a shortage of photos here. There's photos of him checking into his hostel on the Upper West Side, where he actually pulled down his mask to flirt with somebody who was working there, according to reports of people who work there. Then there's the photos of him in a taxi cab. New York has cameras everywhere, so they've released now a half dozen plus photos of him in various parts of the city. The FBI is offering $50,000 for information. The NYPD is offering $10,000 for information here. And it's pretty remarkable that given the number of pictures of his face we still don't have a name. Like nobody said, hey, I know that guy from high school or college or work, whatever. He sort of has this Jake Gyllenhaal look based on the photos of him at the hostel. But he clearly knew where the victim was going to be. He only was there a few minutes before. That hotel has multiple entrances. He knew what entrance the executive from UHC was going to come in on, knew his schedule. The question is, was he an experienced assassin? He has left a lot of evidence behind. Is he getting cocky here? Is that why he's left so much evidence behind? All of that unclear at the moment, but the mystery continues, and we're now about 5-6 days in. By the way, Jill, I should say Jake Gyllenhaal has nothing to do with this. I just thought that he sort of had a resemblance to Jake Gyllenhaal in one of those pictures. Am I off?
Let's just say if they make a movie about the murder, it wouldn't be far-fetched for Jake Gyllenhaal to play the part.
Casting-wise, it could make sense.
All right, let's head overseas from NBC News while visiting Paris for the new opening of the recently renovated Notre Dame Cathedral. President-elect Trump held a meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. They talked about ending the war in Ukraine nearly 3 years after Russia invaded. Zelensky said the meeting was productive. He wrote on X or Twitter that, quote, we all want this war to end as soon as possible and in a just way. Trump wrote on Truth Social that Russia should never have started the war. He said there should be an immediate ceasefire and negotiations should begin. He added that he knows Vladimir Putin well and that, quote, this is his time to act. And he also said China can help.
What you're seeing here is France and Ukraine are trying to keep Trump on board with helping Zelensky. Trump has said, though, that in his takeaway from the meetings over the weekend was that Zelensky wants peace. He's been trying to push the idea that starting January 20th, that he's going to get the Ukrainians, the Russians together to strike some sort of deal. Of course, any deal, given the situation, means that Putin will likely get control of a good portion of Ukrainian territory that he currently occupies. That's the concern the Ukrainians have here. We should note at the Notre Dame event over the weekend, Joe Biden was not there. He said he had some sort of scheduling conflict, but the First Lady, Jill Biden, was there, as well as you mentioned, President-elect Trump. And it was notable, a lot of people are trying to scrutinize the pictures and video of them talking to each other. They were seated next to each other, curious what Jill Biden and Donald Trump were talking about during that entire ceremony.
And Trump also sat down for his first major interview since being reelected. He went on Meet the Press on Sunday morning. He talked about a ceasefire in Ukraine, adding that Ukraine could possibly expect to receive less military aid from the United States when he takes office. That was just one of the topics covered in that sweeping interview with Kristen Welker. Trump said that he's going to pardon all of those convicted in the January 6th attack on the Capitol on day one. He also doubled down on his plans to deport millions of undocumented immigrants, including those with kids born here in the United States, meaning deporting U.S. citizens. To that, he said he would try to end birthright citizenship. Welker pushed back, pointing out that birthright citizenship is written into the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, to which Trump said they might consider an executive action to change that, even though it would require an amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, we should mention birthright citizenship is if you're born in America, you're an American citizen automatically. It's an interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which states all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. Are citizens of the U.S. Pretty clear there. An amendment to the Constitution would require ratification of 3/4 of the states. We don't have many of these. We've talked about how it's actually really difficult to amend things. So I don't really know what Trump is talking about when he says he's going to just do an executive action here. It does mean, though, that there will likely be a legal case around this. There's even conservative legal scholars who support Trump's deportation plan who say, I don't even think the conservative-leaning Supreme Court would reinterpret the 14th Amendment here. Though Trump alternately, when it comes to what they call dreamers, these are kids who were brought here illegally, not born here, but brought here illegally by their parents. They're called dreamers. They might have lived here. They might not even speak the language. They might have lived here now for decades. They might not even speak the language of their home country, educated here, working here, have families here. And now on those folks, dreamers, Trump said in the interview over the weekend that he is hoping to work with Democrats to find a solution for them. It sounded like that he's not talking about automatically deporting dreamers, which was a concern.
From the Associated Press, on Friday, a U.S. federal appeals court upheld a law requiring China-based ByteDance to sell the popular social media app TikTok next month or face a ban in the United States. The court cited national security concerns in its decision. TikTok had argued that the law was unconstitutional and violated the First Amendment rights of 170 million Americans who use the app. The 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C. rejected that argument, instead backing up the government's narrowly crafted law here that requires TikTok get a new owner or face a ban. President Biden signed that law in April after members of Congress from both parties raised concern about TikTok's connections to the communist Chinese government. If ByteDance fails to sell TikTok by January 19th, the law would require App Store companies like Apple and Google and internet hosting providers to stop hosting TikTok, which effectively would ban the app.
Now, the big question is, you might notice that date, January 19th. The next day, January 20th, is when President-elect Trump is inaugurated. He has not said whether he would enforce the ban when he takes the office, though remember, roll back to his first term where he actually tried to ban TikTok when he was president. He has now come around on TikTok. He is pro-TikTok now. He has said that Meta, that owns Facebook and Instagram, is the enemy of the people. But during the Biden administration here, you saw Republicans and Democrats get together on Capitol Hill, and Biden signed the law banning TikTok. So what does that mean in terms of this TikTok ban or for sale, since he would become president then on January 20th? Well, one big question is, how does the appeal process go from here? TikTok and ByteDance can now appeal to a full lineup of judges on the U.S. Appeals Court. Just 3 of them ruled on this, or they could appeal directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the meantime, they will likely ask for a stay on the ban until it's fully adjudicated. Translation, the ban will not go into effect on January 19th until there's a final decision, which means it will then fall on Donald Trump to potentially enforce this, because that's the thing. Even the Supreme Court rules in favor of this law. Ultimately, who enforces the ban? Well, whoever the current president is and his administration, which would be Trump. So an interesting question here on what happens in terms of enforcement of the law if the Supreme Court ends up backing it up, and that's likely where this thing is going to end up.
All right, a warning about this next story. If you have kids in the car, you might want to fast forward a couple of minutes. This from ABC News. Jay-Z accused in a new lawsuit Sunday of raping a 13-year-old girl in 2000, allegedly along with Sean Diddy Combs. The anonymous accuser is identified only as Jane Doe. She said the assault happened after she was driven to an MTV Video Music Awards after party. The federal lawsuit was originally filed in October in the Southern District of New York, listing Combs as a defendant, but then it was refiled on Sunday to also include Jay-Z, whose real name is Sean Carter. In a statement, Jay-Z, Sean Carter, said, quote, "These allegations are so heinous in nature that I implore you to file a criminal complaint, not a civil one. Whomever would commit such a crime against a minor should be locked away. Would you not agree? These alleged victims would deserve real justice if that were the case." So basically, Moshe, he's saying, look, this is a horrible crime. If this actually happened, you shouldn't be filing a civil case here. You should be filing a criminal one.
So this was filed by an attorney named Tony Busby. He's an attorney for several victims here. He has filed several lawsuits in recent months. All have withheld the complainants' names, accusing initially Diddy of assault and rape. This is the first suit that has named another high-profile defendant. In a statement, the legal reps for Diddy called these suits shameless publicity stunts designed to extract payments from celebrities who fear having lies spread about them. Now, some background here. Federal prosecutors in New York criminally charged Combs in September with racketeering, sex trafficking, and other offenses. He's been behind bars in Brooklyn since then. His trial is scheduled to begin next spring in May. And so beyond the criminal matters there in regards to Diddy, you have these civil suits that have been filed. Now, we should mention that in response to this civil suit, Jay-Z's representatives, his attorneys have now filed their own lawsuit against the accuser's attorneys. And so this all, again, revolves around the MTV Video Music Awards back in 2000. There are some horrible details, horrific details here, but the 13-year-old being taken to a party and the various accusations, sexual assault allegations, the various rape allegations she has here against Carter, against Diddy. We should mention, as part of his statement, Jay-Z added, "My only heartbreak here is for the family. My wife and I will have to sit our children down, one of whom is at the age where her friends will surely see the press and ask questions about the nature of these claims and explain the cruelty and greed of people. I mourn yet another loss of innocence." So Jay-Z there turning things around, saying, look what you're doing to my children by accusing me of such things. Rest assured, this can get a lot of coverage today and in the coming weeks, and we will stay on top of it.
From CNN, the famous ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, worn by Judy Garland, sold at an auction for $28 million. It's reportedly the most valuable piece of movie memorabilia ever sold at auction. The sparkly red shoes are one of 4 pairs that Garland wore in the movie as she played its main character, Dorothy. The sale was nearly 11 times what the auction house had initially expected.
So these slippers, not only iconic because of the film, because of Wizard of Oz, but also what happened to these slippers afterward. A collector had originally lent the ruby slippers to the Judy Garland Museum in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. But in 2005, someone stole the ruby slippers from the museum. 13 years later, in 2018, they were finally found by an FBI sting operation in Minneapolis. 2 people in their 70s at the time were charged with the crime. We should mention that ultimately, once you pay the auction house fee here, the unknown buyer of the ruby slippers is going to have to pay $32.5 million for that pair of shoes. A pricey pair of shoes there, Jill. I hope they keep them safe given the history of these shoes. As far as the previous record here for a piece of entertainment clothing, the Marilyn Monroe famous white dress, $5.5 million. So this is like 6 times that. All right, finally here on this day in history, a happy 64th birthday to Domino's Pizza, originally named Dominick's, founded by a guy named Tom Monahan and his brother James in Ypsilanti, Michigan on this day in 1960.
A nice pronouncer there where you knew the Y was silent, Moshe.
Jill, as a Midwesterner, I want to make sure my people are represented accurately on this podcast. On this day in 1965, A Charlie Brown Christmas made its TV debut, bringing the Peanuts characters to life on CBS. And then in 1983, on this day 41 years ago, I tried the line earlier. Here it is. Care of Al Pacino. Jill, I can't deliver it like Tony Montana, but
no, slightly different than your say hello to my little friend.
Well, first of all, I didn't say it. Say hello to my little friend. Anyway, still, I'm doing it much too cutesy. It's not about to open fire on somebody. Anyway, the point is, Scarface, the iconic crime drama starring Al Pacino, hit theaters on this day in 1983. And finally, music news. On this day in 1989, Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire reaches #1 on the Billboard charts. And for that modern version of it, we can add Assad. The Assad regime goes to, we have another edition this weekend to the modern version of We Didn't Start the Fire.
You could do an entire We Didn't Start the Fire from the year 2024.
Oh, easy. From the month of July.
Which is why, Moshe, we always have plenty to talk about here on the podcast.
Maybe one of you in the Mo News community wants to write a 2024 version alone of 2024, We Didn't Start the Fire, to be played on this podcast before the end of the year. We challenge you.
Maybe we do that as our year in review podcast because we're working on something special for the end of the year.
So just put it to music. Put it to the Billy Joel beat.
Yeah, maybe that's what we'll do. We were going to do predictions, but it's an idea. We'll think about it. All right, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Thanks, everybody.